For those of you all who are listening in, I just want to welcome you to our webinar where we are co-workers in God's service, where we'll be discussing the relationship between farm workers and community gardens and how we can stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters. It's being hosted by Going to the Garden, which is a grant-giving initiative of the Office of Public Witness and the Global Food Crisis of the Church of the Brethren. Going to the Garden is mainly grants to congregations to establish and maintain gardens in their own communities that they can use to address issues of hunger and food insecurity within their own communities. We're also wanting to expand into being able to do advocacy work and education surrounding these issues as well. So this is an education component of that program, and we're really glad that you can join us for it. A couple housekeeping things. If you are interested in getting continuing education units for this webinar, then you can send an email to kfurrow@brethren.org, and then we will get you hooked up with that. And then if you have any questions, we're going to have a time at the end for that where we'll open it up for the three of these folks to answer some questions that you might have. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and introduce who we've got with us tonight to share. And I'm just going to give a brief little introduction, and I'll let them share some more if they feel so inclined when it's their turn to talk. So first we have McClain, who is the Director of Program Operations for Graduate Theological Programs at Loyola University in Maryland. He's just going to be giving a bit of a theological perspective to our discussion tonight. We also have Lindsay Comstock with us, who is the Director of the National Farm Worker Ministry and has done a lot in the world of farm worker support and that sort of thing. And we also have Nico Gumbs, who is the Florida State Coordinator of the National Farm Worker Ministry's youth program, YAYA. So I'm going to back out at this point and go ahead and hand it over to Dan for him to go ahead and share.
Okay, hi. Thank you for welcoming me tonight. It's quite an honor to be invited to speak about the theology of creation and the theology of work, and I'm going to do my best to kind of give a foundation, at least a theological foundation that we can perhaps draw on and maybe even disagree with, but hopefully it'll be fruitful. I'm sure the conversation will be fruitful. So in three parts this evening, I'm going to try and make sense of a theology of creation and work. The first part I'm calling the scriptural basis. I'm going to sort of try to present the panoply of Scripture and what different texts, mostly Hebrew Scriptures, have to say about creation and work. I'm going to give a brief kind of introduction to some things that the Christian tradition has said about creation and work, and then I'm going to end with an even shorter and more provisional kind of suggestion about connections that we can make between the theological tradition of creation and work and our situation today. So I hope that sounds good. Like I said, this is meant to be provisional, and it's meant to kind of inspire conversation. It certainly isn't meant to be any kind of final word on theology of creation or theology of work. And perhaps in the question and answer time, I can make some recommendations about other resources that are out there, and I'm also very interested and very willing to be engaged in an ongoing conversation after tonight's meeting. So the first thing I'll say about creation is that it's really meaningfully, and certainly it's hard to talk comprehensively about creation without talking about the rest of the story. And that makes the doctrine of creation perhaps one of the most exciting, but also one of the most challenging areas of doctrine out there. And by the rest of the story, I mean, of course, not just what happens in Genesis 1 and 2, but what happens in Genesis 3, 4, and in the rest of the Bible, if you want to think about it in terms of the biblical idiom. But perhaps the best way to think about it is that the story of creation is, at one time, one set of stories. On the other hand, creation is like the canvas that the rest of the narrative of salvation history is painted onto. So that's theology of creation. Likewise, it's difficult to talk about a theology of work without first talking about what humans were made for. So what were they made in? What was the intention behind the creation of humans, behind their origins? And then, how did they ruin those intentions? How have humans fallen? How have humans fallen short of what their potential is, their vocation? A theology of work that doesn't think about human vocation as both part of human nature and then complicated by sin isn't much of a theology. So that's creation and work. Creation calls for an account of the fall and the rest of the story, redemption. Similarly, work account of creation or human vocation, and then what humans have done as a result of being given that vocation, and then what God does in reaction to humans' rejection of their vocation. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to explore a theology of creation and work by first laying out the scriptural basis, by touching on some contributions, of the theological tradition, and then making some provisional connections to work today. So first, the scriptural basis. Of course, any theology of creation work has to start with Genesis 1. God creates through his word, which is to say that he speaks creation into existence. Unlike so many other cosmological stories that come from the same era and the same region as the Hebrew Torah, stories, usually some kind of violent and deeply misogynistic creation, God's creation, Yahweh's creation, isn't through a struggle, but is a peaceful story. It's not a story of overcoming. There's nothing that's overcome in Genesis 1. Rather, it's a story about something that is not God coming into being through the bounty of God's very being, his love. So creation is declared good so often in the story. Humans in this story are distinctive as was created in the image of God. What this means, of course, is a matter. What does it mean to say that humans are made in God's image? Some of the things that we can agree on is that being created in the image of God entails certain responsibilities. What are those responsibilities? First, it's humanity's distinct privilege and responsibility to gather diverse members of creation together into what we might call a rational order. So, for instance, in Genesis 2, Adam names the creatures. It's also humanity's distinct privilege to walk in community with God. And finally, it's their privilege and obligation to work the land. All of these are comprised or lost in the fall. Adam and Eve are at odds with the animal population. Eternal communion with God is replaced with immortal life. And the land is entirely at odds with Adam. So that's the kind of Genesis 1 through 3 story. But simply because the scriptural order begins with Genesis, we shouldn't think that Genesis is the foundational text on creation. And in fact, a lot of really interesting work has been done on creation and work in the Psalms. So we might think of the contribution that the Psalms make here is that for the pious Hebrew, meditation on the law and cosmos lead to purity. Hey, buddy. Meditating on law and meditating on cosmos simultaneously is the work of the Torah scholar, and that leads to purity. And so the Psalms so often tell us things like work. Anyone's work is entirely in vain if it's not the Lord's work. That comes from Psalm 136. So in Psalm 19, of course, this is a really classic psalm about creation. We're told that the heavens declare the glory of God. In this psalm, creation, or the world, the cosmos, is always correlated to the law, which is perfect. The law is sure, the law is right, the law is clear, pure, true, it's worth more than gold, it's sweeter than honey. The Hebrew scholar in Alexandria, Philo, said that the order of God's fashioning of the earth is the same order that he instills in the law. So we have this parallel set up between the law as coming from God and the world coming from God. They both have the same source. And so Philo says we shouldn't be surprised to find that the order of both, the kind of DNA of both the law and the cosmos is the same DNA. This would be easily deduced, he thinks. The psalmist continues in Psalm 19 asking the Lord not to let the insolent have dominion over him. This dominion, the dominion of the insolent, would lead the psalmist into faults. Instead, in the final stanza, he says, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my..." The psalmist works to meditate on the law of the Lord, the law of the created everything. So Psalm 19, the classic psalm for thinking about law and cosmos as of the same order. Now, that's all well and good, right? It's all coming from God. God's the source. But then we get psalms like Psalm 8, where the creation theme is tied to humanity's dominion over creation. And these are some psalms that are, or themes really, that are under a lot of fire these days. What does it mean for humans to have dominion? Isn't dominion really just domination? In Psalm 8, human work is seen as a kind of reimagining or representation of God's initial creative work, right? And that sounds really nice. You know, humans have this duty and this privilege to work, and that is a kind of reimagining of God's creative work. And this sets humans apart. It makes them distinctive. But this gets really abused, right? I mean, this can be used as a kind of a rationale for, really carte blanche we want. And that's our privilege. But in Psalm 15, 65, and 90, dominion is entirely qualified by the triple themes of living a blameless life, of the theme of the frailty of human life, and the theme of God's providence. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the term providence, it means that God is both and powerful, and really it means that God is powerful enough to carry out in all cases his good will. We can rely on God. He's both good and powerful. And so these themes of living a blameless life, human life is frail, and God's providence, these qualify this idea of human dominion over the earth. And these are also themes that show up very powerfully in the book of Job, to those of you who know that story. And so the Psalms by no means give humans a carte blanche for doing whatever they want. They have a responsibility, a pleasure, but also an obligation to live their very frail lives blamelessly under the Lord their Creator, who has providence to carry out his will. Really quickly to Genesis 4. Some of you might know the story of Cain and Abel. Cain, of course, is a farmer in this proverb. Cain, by murdering his brother, is rejected by the land. The Genesis 4 story tells us. The land rejects Cain's attempts to work it because he has spilled his brother's blood into the soil. And so Cain is destitute and he's vagrant after that. This idea of the land rejecting the farmer or the farmer rejecting the land is another interesting theme that gets represented in the Torah and in the Hebrew Scriptures. Of note, in Samuel, after Saul becomes king, one of his first battles, he goes against the Philistines but doesn't have any soldiers. He has farmers. And so Saul compels all of his would-be soldiers to farm implements into weapons. This is one of the first, as we see, of this theme of farm implements and weapons being juxtaposed with one another. Again, we see this in Isaiah 2:4 and Micah 4:3, but this time, instead of the farm implements being beaten into weapons, the weapons are beaten into farm implements. And these, of course, are the famous prophecies of the reign of the Messiah, in which swords will be beat into plowshares. So these prophecies foretell the reversal of the curse where the land and the farmer are at odds with one another. And this is all part of the messianic promise. In the New Testament, we get less explicit references to the concrete situation on the ground, so to speak. What instead we get is a reflection of life that takes as its context the communion or the lack of communion that people have with their land. So, for instance, in the Beatitudes, it's all about these different classes of people inheriting the earth and inheriting the kingdom of God, the meek, for instance. And in John, we see the resurrected Christ mistaken for... In the Christian tradition, the most important work that humans do, in the Christian theological tradition, I would say, the most important work that humans do, according to authors, for instance, like Athanasius, is contemplate God. I was just talking to my students about this in class today. Is it the case that this idea that disembodied contemplation is anti-material, or that it's antithetical to bodily existence? But contemplation is in fact a very bodily affair, and it lifts the body up, it lifts the world up, it lifts the land up. So this is not that people ought to spend their whole lives in abstract, disembodied musings about God. Rather, it's quite the opposite. To live a life of contemplation is to live a life of deep communion between Creator and creation. It's really to bring the Creator creation and to bring creation to the Creator. So for Athanasius in his classic text on the Incarnation, the work of creatures is contemplation of God. That is true. That's what they were made for. But to contemplate is not to eschew the material realm. Rather, it's to live in relationship with the material realm and to be able to see God in creation, as well as to be able to see God face to face. This is what humans were made for before the fall. However, humanity has become corrupted. Athanasius says that corruption is precisely the loss of the ability to contemplate God. But this also means a loss of relationship with the rest of creation. Paul very famously says, "Now we see through a glass darkly, but then we see face to face." This corruption that we experience ruins both our vision of God and our vision of the world. For Athanasius, the solution to this problem is the Incarnation. God's deep engagement with the material realm as a human. Much like the biblical text, whether wisdom, legal, or parables, the land is often engagement or the object of analysis in the theological tradition. Rather, it's the assumed context of the biblical narrative. Adam's difficulties with the land, Cain's estrangement from the land, these become the dramatic motif that is repeated throughout the stories. So Williams has recently argued we are meant to put ourselves in, to ask who we are in these stories. Not that the land is really the backdrop of stories and personal fulfillment. Rather, quite the opposite. The land is a constitutive part of who we are as we are estranged from God, as we sojourn toward God, and as we are reunited with God. Authors in the theological tradition, like Bonaventure, for instance, argue that the material realm is drawn up into the reunion with God precisely through God's involvement with humanity. So it's because of the Incarnation and what the Incarnation means for humanity. It also means the involvement, the new sort of welling up of creation into that communion, that divine human communion. to think of the material world and ourselves in this way is to think of the material world as created and to think of ourselves as creatures. The third theme that I want to explore in the theological tradition is engagement with each other. So as we come to see ourselves as constituted a small part by matter, right? We're creatures, we're made from stuff. This is to think of ourselves as creatures. We begin to notice that we share this creatureliness with others, other beings. It's also to see how unrelated we've become, to see how divided that we've become, both directly to other persons and, we've become unrelated in a direct way, right, between one another, but we've also become unrelated in indirect ways through our practices of living in a world, practices that are sometimes inherently hostile. And so, again, just to sort of remind us of how this started, thinking work really entails thinking about creation and the origins of humanity. But to think about creation and the origins of humanity is to think about what's happened in the interim. And so for theologians like Athanasius, this is the backdrop that invites the incarnation. All right, so my final section, and I'll try to wrap this up, is some sort of provisional remarks about what the theological tradition can mean for us today, and how we can invite theological reflection in our own reflections about our work and meaning making and meaning finding in our own situations today. Recently, several authors have reminded us of a very ancient tradition of thinking about virtue. Virtue in Latin really just means power or potential. And so this is the connection that I'm going to make, is that human potential or human intention and vocation was originally to contemplate God, but to contemplate God through creation, to have such a right relationship with the material order, that we see God in the material order, that we see God's blessing all around us. In order to do that, in order to have that right relationship, we need to cultivate practices and habits of being and attitudes of being to the world, and we can call these virtues, I think. I think that's a really helpful way to think about them. Matthew Crawford, in a really wonderful book that came out, I guess, in the last decade, called Shop Class as Soulcraft. This is a kind of like, this is kind of a revisiting of the Zen and Art of Motorcycle Maintenance book, for those of you who read it and maybe enjoyed it. But Crawford, in this really wonderful book, gives an analysis and an apologetic, a defense of meaningful work, what he calls meaningful work. Meaningful work is work that engages the whole human. It engages all of us, all people, but it engages the whole of ourselves. Not just our minds, not just our bodies, but it engages the whole person. Meaningful work, he argues, not only fulfills the individual, but it also fulfills the person precisely as a communal and a pragmatic being. So people need to be together, they need to work together, they need to be part of traditions of work, but they also need to be given the opportunities to solve problems, to do things that are challenging, to do things that stretch their limits. That's what he means by pragmatic. Arts, which he also calls the stochastic arts, which is a kind of fancy Greek term for fixing. The stochastic arts, these include things like mechanical work, farming, really anything that requires the whole person, and manual, right? It requires the whole person as a thinking, doing person. These are part of the pragmatic nature of humanity. These are things that if we can't access, leave us only partially human. And I want to end with just a quote here from Crawford, and just to say, as I read this quote, what he has in mind here is that these arts, the manual arts, meaningful work, these not only sort of make us feel good about ourselves, but these help us discover ourselves in ways that others we wouldn't. Without this kind of meaningful work, we fall short of what we're meant to be. So he says, because the stochastic arts diagnose and fix things that are variable, complex, and not of our own making, and therefore they are not fully knowable, they require a certain disposition toward the thing you're trying to fix. This disposition is at once cognitive and moral. Getting it right demands that you be attentive in the way of a conversation rather than assertive in the way of a demonstration. I believe the mechanical arts have a special significance for our time because they cultivate not creativity, but the less glamorous virtue of attentiveness. Things need fixing and tending no less than creating. So I hope this theological foundation that I've will be helpful for our conversation, and once again I thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And I don't know who I'm handing it off to now.
Okay, Lindsay, if you are ready to go ahead and talk. Thank you, Dan, for that. So we'll go ahead and pass it on to Lindsay.
Sure, thank you, Katie. And thank you for that theological foundation. It's at the heart and soul of what we do at National Farmworker Ministry. Again, my name is Lindsay Comstock. I'm the Executive Director of the National Farmworker Ministry. We're approximately 45 years old. We were birthed about 93 years ago, initially called the Migrant Ministry, and have been a national organization for the last 43 years. Our mission is essentially this. We're a faith-based organization, faith-based nonprofit, that's committed to justice for and empowerment of farm workers. And the language of for and with and of is intentional. National Farmworker Ministry educates, equips, and mobilizes people of faith to support farm worker-led efforts to improve their own living and working conditions. The language of solidarity is what we use in our mission statement. Paulo Freire, bell hooks, they all speak to these ideas of standing in solidarity with the poor and the marginalized. And so at National Farmworker Ministry, we're very intentional about not leading campaigns for betterment of living and working conditions for farm workers, but rather letting the farm workers lead those. And essentially, we take our direction from them. We do that by partnering with the large unions and associations that represent farm country, and through their collective voice, we then have an ear to what might be helpful from the faith community. And then we go out and we educate and we provide resources for faith communities in order for the broader community, the broader faith community, to understand what might be useful and helpful in using the power and privilege that many of us have, that we maybe don't necessarily deserve, but that many of us have in order to be influential for farm worker rights. And so much of what you were sharing, Dan, relates to that in the sense that we understand at the very core the equity that God speaks to in creation and with the land, and very much us wanting that for our farm worker brothers and sisters as they work so diligently each and every day to feed this nation. We began in the 1920s, like I said, actually a direct service-based organization. We did charity work. We provided food and clothing and daycares for farm workers. And then in the 1960s, someone you may be familiar with, Cesar Chavez, came along in the 1960s and began organizing farm workers and organizing them in the fields to better their own conditions. And at that point, Cesar and others in the movement called on the faith community to shift the focus from charity to justice, shifting the focus from direct service-based ministry into an advocacy-based model. At that point, all of the migrant ministries throughout the country came together with the National Council of Churches, and what was birthed was a national organization that would focus solely on advocacy. Direct service agencies are definitely needed in the work that is done advocating for farm workers, providing for needs that they might have, but we also understand the need to look systemically at the injustice that farm workers face and to address that with the faith community as well. And so today, 43 years later, we still bring together national denominations and state councils of churches, religious orders, and individual congregations, and sometimes just concerned individuals, people of faith themselves. We bring them together on our board of directors to act alongside farm workers in fundamental change. Some of the major campaigns that we support, include the Fair Food Campaign with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, based largely out of Florida. You may have heard about that. They have quite a social presence. And they also have a rather important movie that's launching November 21st called Food Chains that will address their Fair Food program and the changes it's making in the fields for tomato pickers. We also support the Reynolds Tobacco Campaign with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. This is a seven-year campaign now that's run largely out of North Carolina, advocating for better living and working conditions for tobacco pickers. And they also are in the Kentucky and Tennessee area as well. And then we also work with the United Farm Workers of America on their Dairy Gold and Grow-In campaigns. Dairy Gold is a cooperative of dairy workers in the Pacific Northwest, and Grow-In Farming is the largest stone fruit producer in the United States, and they're based out of Fresno, California. And we have been working with the UFW to try to pressure the owners of Grow-In Family Farming to allow a farm labor contract on their farm, so that many workers can get better wages and they can get days off. Just so you know, thousands and thousands of Grow-In workers will be working this Thanksgiving in Fresno rather than being at home with their families. And if they had had that farm labor contract, they would have a paid day off. And so that's just a small glimpse of what these unions and associations are able to do when farm workers are able to bring their collective voice together. Katie, if you wouldn't mind queuing up the slides. I thought, presentation-wise, the easiest thing to do in my short 15 minutes was to just give you a brief introduction to who we are at NFWM, and then to connect you as best we can to the work that we do and the resources that we have to get you plugged in. And so what you see here is a screenshot of our webpage. I'm going to type in our webpage over here on the message board on the side in case you want to follow in real time, and you have the web in front of you. I assume you do if you're on this. It's just nfwm.org, and this is the main page that you'll see as it pops up. Some significant things I want to point out to you on this main page. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, there's an orange button. It says Join Our Mailing List. This is the easiest way to get connected to the work that we do. We send out twice monthly e-blasts that focus on everything from this weather and ways to plug into that. And also action alerts that farm worker campaigns have. There may be a demonstration out in front of a supermarket, or there may be a letter that you can write or a petition you can sign. This is the easiest way to get plugged into those things, is by joining our mailing list. And you can also see our Twitter and Facebook pages there. Scroll down just a little bit, and you'll see in the white box there, it says Recent Articles. If you look at there's about 5 to 8 of those always listed. It's the most recent things that we've posted on our webpage. And again, they go everything from a border reflection of when Nico and I were recently crossing over the border into Mexico, meeting with recent deportees as well as people coming into the United States, most of whom end up in agricultural work, all the way to a soup supper, a fundraiser that someone is having to benefit farm workers. And so you'll see a slew of information always under Recent Articles. And then if you go down to the bottom of this slide, at the bottom it says Youth and Young Adult Network. Nico will tell you more in just a moment, but the Youth and Young Adult Network, or YAYA, is one of our largest, most successful programs at National Farm Worker Ministry. And you can click on that button there at the bottom in the middle, and it will take you to the YAYA website so you can learn more. Okay, next slide. This is over the About screen there, the About button rather. And this is just a way that you can learn more about the history of NFWM. You can learn more about our mission. You can find out how to get in contact with us, our offices. We have staff in Florida, and we also have staff in North Carolina. And then you can also learn who are the member and supporting orgs that make up the board of directors. Church of the Brethren has been a longtime supporter and board member of the National Farm Worker Ministry. And you may find, if you're from another denomination, that in fact your denomination may be represented there. We also have a new category recently where people can associate with us called supporting organizations. These folks don't necessarily serve on our board of directors, but they get the same inside information that our member orgs do, and you can click on the member and supporting organizations to find out who might be represented, and those are largely local congregations that are interested in the work that we do. Okay, next slide. The next slide here, I'm just showing you the resource button. One of the things I said that National Farm Worker Ministry does is we educate, equip, and mobilize. And so education is very, very important. It's the key to any informed action or activism. We believe you have to understand at the core what it is that you're either fighting against or what it is you're fighting for. And so we want to provide you, your faith community, your friends, your family, whomever, all the resources they need to understand farm worker issues, to understand the push and pull factors of immigration, to understand just a learning library, basically, of all the issues that agricultural workers are dealing with and how our trade policies in this country affect those individuals that are working in the fields, etc. So if you were to go to this third tab here and click on Resource Center, you're going to see all of those things, and you can click which tab is of interest to you. The one I want to highlight is the third one down. It says Faith-Based Resources. And Katie, if you'll go to the next slide. If you click on Faith-Based Resources, it's going to take you to this screen right here, and this is exactly what you need if you're a local pastor or a parishioner in worship. We've got all kinds of things that right here at your disposal that you can use. If you need to copyright anything, just give us a little shout out on the back of the page. That's all you really need, and this is for you to utilize. There's prayers, there's litanies, there's a very recent Thanksgiving liturgy that was just put up. One of our Duke Divinity interns worked on that, and it's wonderful. You can adapt it to your context. There's also sample sermons that board members and others have preached in various places. Actually, Church of the Brethren, Nate Hostler is our representative, and he's got a sample sermon on there that you can read. And this is just to give you a jumping off place if you want to preach about or speak about or even have a Eucharist meal where you want to recognize the hard work of farm workers. This is a way for you to bring that into your faith community. Okay, next slide. This is the Farm Worker tab. These are the partners that we have, the unions and associations that they represent the farm workers. They are the collective voice, and so this is how we partner with thousands and thousands of farm workers at one time. Yes, we go out to fields and we have personal relationships, but in order to maximize our relationships, we do that through these unions and associations. The tabs here, you can see them for yourself, the organizations, and then we highlight 3 of the major campaign partners that we have. But right in the middle, you'll see it says campaign packets. And if you click on that, Katie, next slide. If you click on campaign packets, what you're going to get is a comprehensive overview of the history of the organization, the union or the association, the campaign that they're currently in, what National Farm Worker Ministry's stance has been, and what prophetic actions we have been a part of in support of that campaign, and everything you need to educate your constituency about how to get involved. All those action items and pieces are included with a table of contents on every single campaign. So this is for you to utilize. Click on it, download it. They're all in PDF forms. You can adapt it for your context. I know there's an immigration coalition of folks that it recently adapted it. They added it to some other prayers that they have within their own denomination. That's exactly what we want you to do with these things. They're there for your disposal for you to understand complex campaigns in a comprehensive short amount of time. One I want to highlight for you, if you look near the bottom, it will say EFI fact sheet. If you were to click on that fact sheet, and I think it's the next slide, Katie. Yeah, if you click on the fact sheet, you're not actually going to get this article, but basically what you're going to get is information about a food initiative that National Farm Worker Ministry helped birth. We're one of the founding partners. And essentially, the Equitable Food Initiative is a unique partnership between businesses and farm worker organizations that have come together to develop a standard, to develop training processes and a certification to both protect farm workers and produce safer food. Essentially, a study was done of what most concerns people right now regarding food, and at the top of the list was food. And so we said, okay, how can we get equity for farm workers in the field and at the same time address what everyday people are most concerned about regarding their food, which is foodborne illnesses? And so the Equitable Food Initiative, through initial funding and participation with Oxfam America, was birthed. And we have an unprecedented opportunity here to support the EFI and support both farm worker equity and safer food by looking for the EFI label. Equitable Food Initiative just launched a label, and it is first available in Costco, and it's going to start out in the Northwest first. It could come out any day, and it will be on fruits and vegetables in Costco first, and then we're hoping it will sweep the country over to the East Coast. So this is a way you can support a very important initiative is not only creating safer living and working conditions for farm workers, but also safer food for you at home as you feed your family. So a very unique initiative there. But you can get all the campaign packets there if you click under Farm Workers. And then the next tab is probably the most important one that I can leave you with as I close up my time, and that is our news and action. These campaigns are complex. You know, back in the day with Cesar Chavez, a lot of these campaigns, progress happened right there on the picket line or right there on the boycott line out in front of supermarkets. And nowadays, the same is true, except for so much of the change happens behind closed doors and boardrooms. And so keeping up with these campaigns is a bit complex. And so we want you to know that you can click on recent news right here anytime you want and just get that latest information about a particular campaign that interests you or a part of the country that interests you. And at the same time, you always click on Action Alerts, the second tab down, about how you can be getting involved wherever you are. One example of these campaigns is they're not so geographically bound anymore. So, for example, we have the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and their Fair Food campaign down in Immokalee, Florida. And a lot of folks think, well, I don't live in Florida, or you know, I don't eat tomatoes from Florida. Well, you probably do, but if you're living in California, the ways that you can get involved is because a lot of these campaigns are what we call third-party consumer campaigns, and so they're run through supermarkets or they're run with fast food companies. And so the Fair Food campaign right now is putting pressure on Publix supermarkets and Wendy's. Well, there's a Wendy's everywhere, and so there's a way that you can get involved regardless of your location in a lot of these campaigns that we have going on. And so Action Alerts is the easiest way to know how to get involved in a particular campaign of interest to you. We also have an NFWM blog, and this is where myself and others on our staff just share musings about interactions we've had or musings about our faith in relation to the work that we do alongside farm workers. And so it's a way to interact with us on a bit more personal level. And if any of you have information or blogs you'd like to share with us, we'd be happy to feature those. So this is just a brief overview of our website and the ways to get connected. So we'd love for you to join our mailing list and get involved. But for us, when we think about community gardens, when we think about food in general, we think it's of the utmost importance that folks always remember the full trajectory of the food chain, and that when we're talking about food on our table, when we're talking about food in our Lord's Supper or Eucharist moments, regardless of when we think about food, at the very beginning of that supply chain, hard-working men, women, and children, largely from south of here, who are laboring day in and day out in conditions that are just not fair and getting paid wages that are just not fair. And so we're doing everything we can by mobilizing faith communities to change that reality. So I appreciate the time of being on here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have later on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that, Lindsay. And we'll go ahead and pass it on over to Nico. Nico, are you there? Well, it seems like we might be having some technical difficulties on Nico's end there. So while we maybe wait for Nico to get back with us, we can go ahead and open up to some questions if folks have questions. There's a chat bar on the side of your screen, hopefully. So if you have any questions, you can just send them through that way. I think we've gotten a couple already. And Dan and Lindsay can hopefully speak to those a little bit.
And I don't know if you want to speak to that. I can speak to it from our perspective to begin, but Taylor, you bring up a good point, the caring about creation in relation to larger issues, environmental issues, and how they relate to farm worker rights. You know, for us at National Farm Worker Ministry, obviously first and foremost in our mind is the care and the protection of farm workers, and these larger global environmental issues affect them day in and day out. And so things like pesticides are of huge concern to us. A lot of us, when we think about pesticides, we think about pesticides and GMOs and what we take into our own bodies, but of great concern to us is also those laboring in the field to see to it that it gets to our table without too much pesticide, or making sure it's labeled GMO. We want to know what we're eating. And so care about creation in relation in these environmental issues in relation to farm workers is part of the equation for us. And so you'll find National Farm Worker Ministry mobilizing to see to it that the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has stronger protections, stronger labeling for pesticides and things like that. You'll see National Farm Worker Ministry supporting the climate change march and other things that go on and pushing back on Monsanto because these do affect farmers and they do affect us. And Dan, I'll leave it to you to talk about the caring and creation in relation to that, but it's definitely something that's part of the equation for us, in addition to how trade policies and politics and those matters also affect the push and pull of farmers in the field.
Well, it looks like Nico's back, so I'll let him go. Close.
Oh. Yeah, if you maybe just want to go ahead, Dan, and keep with us.
Okay. So I was at a conference this summer where I gave a real brief workshop on meaningful work. And hey, Nico, are you there?
I think I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You can continue with what you were saying, and then I'll go ahead and start.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, I think systemic change is really important. Obviously, we need the kind of procedural and political changes, and a lot of the stuff that these organizations is fighting for, unionization. I think that's all very, very good. One of the things I tend to encounter, at least in the sort of circles of people that I travel in, the academy, for instance, or sort of mainline denominations, I don't get a lot of resistance to those systemic changes. But what I do see is a lot of difficulty in internalizing what creation care means at the level of an individual life that's already, quite willing to go along with say, greening measures, for instance. But what does that look like for an individual life? And this is where a lot of my own presentation, this is the inspiration for my presentation, is thinking about what we do in our own habits and how we can bring other people who don't share those opinions with us, how we can bring them into the fold. And so one of the things that Crawford is helping us see, I think, is that it's not always going to be through argumentation that we change minds and we change hearts, but rather it's going to be through habits and practices of living. So the workshop that I led this summer was saying, maybe if we start small in our own lives, if we maybe start experimenting with things for ourselves, making our own durable goods, obviously, making your own food, buying locally, that's important. But once you've bought your products, right, like how do you handle them at home? What are some things that you can do to not only sort of source locally, but in fact produce locally? It's in those kinds of activities, those kind of habits of living that I think hearts are more likely to change. But it means small change. And so it's not that I'm opposed to systemic change. It's really important. It's just not something that I perhaps my finger on the pulse of, but rather what I'm really fascinated about, interested in doing is helping people start to sort of extend their own vision for their lives to include, like I said, not only local sourcing but local production, and perhaps even production in the home. Those are some building blocks for starting to answer Taylor's question, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I believe I'm back on now, officially. I apologize about the technical difficulties there. As already mentioned, my name's Nico. I work for the National Farmworker Ministry as the state coordinator of the youth down here, also known as the Youth and Young Adult Network of the National Farmworker Ministry. What we do down here in Florida with YAYA is we organize our communities, young adults specifically, in support of farm workers. We educate people and institutions about the many conditions and issues and injustices that farm workers face on daily, and mobilizing them in support of the many campaigns that Lindsay brought up. We in Florida here also support all of those campaigns. We do so by participating in a diverse array of activities that could lead from anything to letter writing campaigns in support of immigration reform, peaceful marches in the spirit of nonviolence worker movement, and mostly awareness events to really get out the word about farm workers, right? Whenever I do these presentations, one of the first things that comes to mind and how to open it is, did you eat today? And a lot of people are like, yeah, of course, I ate today, you know? And thinking through that, why I asked that question is because at the end of the day, someone touched that food and harvested, planted it, put their love and time into that plant for it to get to the supermarket and whatnot. And so through our work at YAYA, we build relationships on a national and statewide level, and as well as leadership within our own group, right? And so, Katie, if you want to go ahead and pull up the slide. So yeah, where does your food come from? You know, is a pivotal question. And move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So something that we do down here in Florida is we work with the Farmworker Association of Florida, and they are a community-based organization that has 5 offices throughout the state. And what they've started is a project initiative in all 5 offices throughout the state. 3 have fully taken off, but YAYA has been at the inception of these community gardens, right? Conveniently named Campesinos Garden, meaning farm worker. It started off in Fellsmere, and so what you're shown is one of the mini garden days that we did with the Fellsmere community, which is run for farm workers and by farm workers, right? And so we've been working with Fellsmere, the Fellsmere office of the Farm Worker Association for about 4 years now, and we began the relationship in the spring of 2010, where we began to clear the land that you see pictured there behind all those beautiful people, to clear the land for this community garden initiative, right? And since 2010, we've been traveling down to Fellsmere to volunteer at this community garden every month or 2 months. Our volunteering with the Farm Worker Association of Florida and the Fellsmere Community Garden has ranged from anything to, you know, starting plots, planting seeds, and most recently we've been able to help the Fellsmere community specifically selling the harvested produce in their local farmers market. You can go to the next slide, Katie. Thank you. So as I said, it started in 2011, the Camepsinos Garden, through a partnership with local city officials and community residents, right? And the residents of the Fellsmere community are primarily orange pickers. It's in Indian River County. And what they've decided to do is the Campesinos Garden is located mostly, or Fellsmere, excuse me, is located mostly in a food desert. And for folks who don't know what a food desert is, it's exactly what it says it is. It pretty much means that there's no food around for miles that people can get to easily, like we could get to in the city or suburbia and stuff like that. And so through the Kellogg Foundation, FWAF, or the Farm Worker Association of Florida, was able to secure a grant that paved the way for breaking the ground of this garden. The first year brought in over 25 garden member families, where local residents participated in this community garden, and later on they decided to get their own plots to grow their own food too. So far it's provided food for nearly 100 families throughout Fellsmere. It's fed us on the multiple times that YAYAs have traveled down actually volunteer in the garden as well. You can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the many benefits of the community garden, as you can tell, or as you can see, is that, you know, the members are learning gardening skills. To be a farm worker or to harvest food is a job that is done with dignity. It is a job that takes much skill that is often overlooked. And so through the community garden, Fellsmere has been able to teach the youth about food production, composting, teaching them just basic skills and aspects of the community that they're involved in. They have gained a sense of knowledge of the community that they're a part of. Their access to the food is increased due to the community garden. The consumption of fresh and local food is increased. And people actually build relationships with the local government officials through the work on the community garden project. It also has increased awareness in sustainable farming as well. And it's allowed space for the community members to interact throughout the whole process. And we've seen that, you know, over the past 4 years that a lot of families have come together and shared food with not only us, the Yayas who come to visit, but also with themselves outside of it. So you can go to the next slide. As I mentioned before, the community garden just recently started in Fellsmere to sell in their local farmers market. This was a very interesting process to see, seeing as I've been a part of the community garden since its inception. First starting off as a volunteer with Yaya, and now working my way to being a state coordinator. But seeing the farmers market and seeing what it's been able to reap, the benefits for not only the Fellsmere community, the Farmworkers Association of Florida, but also the members, the community members who are involved. Learned a lot through the Campesinos Garden, and so have its members, just having conversations with the local community outside of the farm worker community that lives in Fellsmere. You know, that's because there's nothing like receiving local and fresh produce that is harvested right in your backyard. And it's also allowed for folks to get involved with the community garden more so. Instead of just buying the produce, they can actually go grow their own food, and that's what we try. That's what the FWA, the Farm Worker Association, tries to promote amongst people. Katie, if you want to go to the next, I think a slide, that's it, maybe not. So before I get into the slide of what you can do, I really want to hound into what the Fellsmere Community Garden model is all about. And so the mission of the garden is to raise awareness among the low-income farm worker families and other community members about the importance of producing and consuming locally grown produce and using methods that respect the environment. The vision of the community garden is just clearly to improve the health of the local community members through this providing of fresh and local produce, right? And so the Campesinos Garden, or the community garden model, is based off of really agroecology principles, right? And meaning the principles are rooted in traditional agricultural knowledge to improve the local food systems in farm worker communities, and on a national level to improve the way in which that we produce, the way in which that we harvest and grow produce nowadays, right? Because we've noticed over time, going back to the pesticides thing, is that a lot of runoff from high industrialized agriculture gets into the ground, seeps into the ground, and then the pesticides, even if the food is supposedly grown organically, it ends up being grown in this pesticide-ridden soil, right? And so at this point, our soil is ruined, and there's really no way to get back at that besides starting all over again. And so what we see through the Campesinos Garden is really just trying to get back to that model of really hounding in on learning about the land and learning how the land affects you as a person and the produce in which you eat. So these principles are based off of growing organically with the intention of these food deserts, these low-income communities, reclaiming and traditional growing knowledge in alignment with the Earth's natural systems and cycles, governed by community decision-making of garden members, so they all decide on what to do, what they want to sell, what they want to produce for the season, and whatnot. And it's supported by, like I said before, local government and through provisions of land and resources. And it's really connected the establishment of community members who don't necessarily live in this farm worker community, but maybe in a neighboring community, to come to the farmers market and learn more about the plight of farm workers, the work that they're doing in the community garden, and whatnot. So through my work with Yaya and farm workers and building relationships with the Fellsmere community and whatnot, it's really, as Lindsay said, this third-party, consumer base that you want to touch on. As a consumer in cities and suburban areas, we have a lot of bargaining power in supermarkets and in local farmers market, and it's so important for us to ask where our food comes from. Whether it's the farmers market or the local grocer that you go to, being organic is just not enough, right? And I want to make that clear. The buying locally is just not enough, because it can still be harvested with the same application that we see on large industrialized sized farms. And so we have to get away from this idea of greenwashing, that organic and local means that it's good for us, right? Because there's someone that's probably suffering at the very beginning of that process. And that's what we're trying to eliminate here at Yaya and at the National Farm Worker Ministry. And so it's really important for us to do research on the brands that we buy, right? And the less information that there is out there for us, the more so that we know we need to dig in deeper to see what's happening in the supply chain. So do your research. Do they support sustainable agriculture practices? Are they really looking into energizing the soil, right? Are they looking to get away from pesticide-free and use mostly natural pesticides, like marigolds, for instance, to get away insects and ants from your local garden space? Do they treat the workers who are producing fairly, right? So we hear a lot about family farms, but even on family farms, they're probably outsourcing their labor to migrant workers or day laborers or farm workers as we know them. And so we want to know, are the wages at a reasonable price where they can also feed their families, right? Because a lot of the times we see farm workers go and pick and harvest hundreds of pounds of oranges and tomatoes within a day, and they go home with barely nothing to feed themselves, right? And also another important thing that we like to look at is, do they provide adequate housing for migrants who are crossing over here too, for the workers during that growing season? Because we want to make sure that not only are these workers being paid fairly, but they're also living in humane conditions as well. And through the Farm Worker Association of Florida, through the work that the Fellsmere community has doing and the other 4 offices that they have across the state, we've seen that these community gardens have really, these farm worker communities, in the sense of no longer are they isolated and so far away from food, but they are also involved in growing the food, becoming more of a community, and working together and finding out maybe that they're working on the same farm and there are issues that they necessarily haven't been able to talk about. So the community garden provides an outlet, not for just to build community amongst each other, but also to just learn these traditional knowledges and skills that these mostly indigenous farm workers have brought with them from Central and South America to teach us about. And so, yeah, that wraps up my end of the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nico. And thanks to all 3 of you for sharing with us. It's really been a pleasure to hear from all of you. We want to open it up to everybody listening in. If you have questions, again, the chat bar is on the side, so you can check that out. And again, we've already got some questions in there, so I'll turn it over to Dan, Lindsay, and Nico again to maybe give some answers to those.
Katie, I didn't see any more questions other than one at the top. There was one consumer-based advocacy actions. I was just referencing, it was Jonathan. He was asking if there are, under the NFWM resource page, if there is information on consumer-based advocacy actions, and I was telling him that it's not under the resource page, it would be under the action alerts, and that the majority of all of our actions are consumer-based, and they're done in collaboration with the farm worker associations. And so if you go under action alerts, that would be the easiest way to get connected to those. And I don't see any questions.
You're right. I didn't read that too close. And so, yeah, so if anyone else has any questions, then go ahead and we'll just kind of give that a minute. But if nobody does, then we'll finish up. But so we'll give it a minute for folks if you think of something.
I just wanted to reference one of the things that Dan said earlier. I think the push for local and the push for knowing where our food comes from and investing in that for ourselves personally is a really valuable perspective. I think if we're required to till the land, we're going to appreciate it in a different way. At the same time, one of the complexities that we deal with in our work is, and the reason we work with these large associations and unions is because statistically the majority of people in America are still fed by places like Walmart. And as much as I would do absolutely anything not to shop at Walmart personally, we are trying to acknowledge that the majority of constituency, that's what they can afford. And at the same time, we really commend those who are trying to live closer to the land. And so for me, it's a balance between the two. My sister and her husband, their own farm, and they're seeing how difficult it is to till the soil and to care for animals and all of those things, and also just do the daily goings on of regular life in this country. And at the same time, I interact with folks on a daily basis who can't afford fresh fruits and vegetables in that food desert that Nico was speaking to. So I definitely appreciate that perspective, and I'm glad you spoke to that. And at the same time, we, at our work, we try to balance that out and also address the bigger concerns for folks. So, thank you, Dan.
No, thank you for that. Like I said, I want to give sort of systemic change its due. It's necessary. I think the best approach probably is a two-pronged approach where we're hitting it from both sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Folks like yourself who are really pushing the system, maybe individuals like myself in my community where I'm inviting to think about the supply chain, and to think about, like you said, what are and actually what Nico was pointing out too, what are the skills and the habits and the dispositions that are involved in the production of food and the production of our durable goods. If we're changing, the reality at the say the bureaucratic systemic level, but we're also changing minds and hearts at the local level. How they approach the process. Maybe a good way to think about this is what's the spirituality of work and production that goes into the average person's participation in the marketplace. If we're doing both of those, I think we're doing good work.
Absolutely, and when you touched on the trajectory of the supply chain, if we're something more than just the consumers at the end of it, I think we do appreciate it and understand it in a different way. Putting our hands in the soil, understanding the growing process, the harvesting process, all of those things are really valuable. Right now, so many of us are just simply the consumers. We just eat it at the end of the supply chain. And what you're calling for is a living closer to the land, and me too, for that matter, and looking at the whole perspective. And so I really appreciate that. I think having people who are spiritually connected to growing of food in that way are going to be more informed advocates for a holistic perspective of food in our country.
No, I think in fact a lot of what Nico talked about is I'm really sympathetic to that. I want to explode. I want to blow up and destroy the class of the consumer. I think that we've been too complacent as a people to settle into that role, and I'm constantly doing that in the classroom. I want my students to I want to analyze it. I want them to analyze themselves. I want them to see their way out of that classification.
A good book that comes to mind for me in relation to this conversation, Dan, and you may be familiar with it and other folks might be interested in it. It's called The American Way of Eating. And it's a young woman who basically went in undercover, and she started with the full, the beginning of the supply chain, farm workers, and she went to California and just kind of tried to blend in and be a farm worker and look at it all the way from there to a fast food worker, all the way to a factory worker that's packing shelves. And so she looked at food in a different way and the commercialization of food. And she definitely, by the end of that book, came to a different perspective, but at the same time wanting to exploit that model of consumers. And so that book was transformative for me. I think the author is Tracy McMillan. If anybody's interested, it's called The American Way of Eating.
Thank you for that. I wanted to recognize that we have some questions popping up in the sidebar here. And do you mind if we start with Taylor's, and you mind if I take a crack at that?
Go ahead.
So Taylor asks, often the creation theology is centered on the Old Testament for obvious reasons. How do we understand the Gospels on the subject of creation care? This is a really good question, and one that I knew I would need to develop more from what I currently have in my presentation. Let me start by saying that I think that the authors of the Gospels see themselves as writing in the same tradition as the law and the prophets, that as followers of Christ, they don't see themselves offering a different law, but rather they're participating in a tradition that's begun by the one who calls himself the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So if the Gospels then are sort of seriously developing the Torah tradition, then what we have in the Gospels, as I alluded in my presentation, is thinking about the land as the backdrop to all of this kingdom of God thinking. So then how do we understand the Gospels speaking about the subject of creation care? For the world of late antiquity, destruction of the environment wasn't quite the pressing concern that it is for us today, but the production of food was a very pressing concern, and so it's not for nothing that so many of the parables are really about the production of food and about the enjoyment of food, right? So you've got parties, weddings, farms, vineyards. These are all the context of Christ's parables, for instance, in Matthew. So I think at bare minimum we can say that clearly the author of Matthew is very conscious about his relationship and his people's relationship to the land, and really we could say their dependency upon the land, but also their reliance on a healthy relationship with the land. So I think that's where we could start. There's certainly more that could be said about that, but I would want to defer to perhaps somebody who's a little bit more of an expert in the New Testament, which unfortunately I am not.
Okay, thanks for that, Dan. Lindsay or Nico, do you all want to weigh in on that question?
Answer the first question?
The one from Taylor that Dan was just kind of talking about creation theology in the Old Testament versus the New in the Gospels. If not, we can move on to the next one. From Gita Gretsch for, if you were challenging youth, what would be one or two beginning changes that they could make? Would it be personal or activism, like learning? So if one of you all want to take that, maybe?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think as someone who still identifies as the youth and how I first got involved, both personal and activism learning were centered around how, as a youth, I was challenged to think outside of this institution that told me that I shouldn't care about the food system or that told me that I should do other things that made absolutely no sense with my morals and ethics. And so I think one of the beginning changes that youth can make is just, learning from other folks, having these conversations with folks, but also I think in order to really live a full life, you have to personally live out that life, right? And so just learning about it is not necessarily always enough, but also participating in that. And so that's why I'm so drawn to the work of the National Farm Worker Ministry and YAYA, is because we were working with farm workers, not for farm workers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nico. Yeah, Dan or Lindsay, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to say briefly in relation to what Nico said, that one of the initiatives that National Farm Worker Ministry is taking on now is something we call an immersion delegation program. And this is in its infancy and developing right now. But the idea is that the transformational, the people that feel most transformed by the movement and who are most invested in the movement are those who have had a personal relationship with farm workers and have seen and experienced the conditions themselves. And it really goes back to the core of how we do the work that we do in solidarity with farm workers rather than over and against and perpetuating the colonialism of the past, is that we need to hear directly and we need to meet and have a relationship with these farm workers. And so an immersion delegation program would essentially do that. We would be a National Farm Worker Ministry, the conduit between people of faith who are interested in learning, who have something to teach us about our own food system. And so in relation to this question, I would say, beginning changes could be just exposing oneself to understanding food in a new way. One thing that often comes to mind for me with regard to workers in this country is that if you think about workers, really hardcore blue-collar workers, we always put them behind a wall, whether they're cooking food or they're boxing on shelves. Those workers are always behind a wall. And so do we really value in this country when we always kind of relegate it to the back and it's kind of protected and we don't want to look at it, and we just think that magically at 8 a.m. then our grocery store shelves are stocked full of food, and that there's not people with families trying to feed their own loved ones that are stocking those shelves. And so I think there's an awareness could be a beginning change about what it takes machine going, what it takes to feed a nation, what it takes to feed a family for that matter. Kind of awareness could be a beginning change. And just looking at the workers who are kind of stuck behind a wall that we don't really pay attention to, involved in being a minimum wage worker, or like a farm worker who may not have wage because they're undocumented for them. So I think just paying attention in a different way could be a beginning that people could be engaged with. Another one, again, is media space if you can. The Society of St. Andrew comes to mind in the cleaning of the fields. They let youth groups and other participants all of a sudden you get to realize just how hard it is to harvest sweet potatoes or any other fruit or vegetable for that matter. And at the same time, people learn. So that's what comes to mind for me.
This is all really reflection for me. I'm really, really glad I'm taking part in this conversation tonight. Graduate. I wanted to make the class really meaningful for them. Final project hand, making something by hand. One of the experiences I had this summer was reading. Many of them started with sort of grand aspirations about what they thought that they could do prior to. I'm going to build a table. I'm going to build a table from scratch, and then they in depot and they ask the employees there, what do I need to build a table? And they learn, in fact, that building a table is way up. By the time they finally settled on a project, they had maybe 3.5 weeks left in our summer term, and pulling a project together, less than a month, is really difficult. I had no concept of that. By the end of it, they had how difficult it was to make something. And most of them, by the end, didn't
they used prefabricated materials and they assembled something. But even then, they had a clear notion of the fact that they relied on these prefabricated materials in order to complete the project, write the paper, and actually that process of coming to awareness and in fact humbling themselves, being able to acknowledge, I don't know how to do this, I need to ask for help. This was as I saw it, they not only learned about virtue, but they actually grew in virtue insofar as they came to that humility. I was very fortunate that project worked out. I've since thought about ways that I can implement the same kind of inspiration that went into my ethics class into other classes. And so in the spring, one of the teaching is what we call service learning optional. So it's a service learning course, but the students have a choice to participate in the service learning component or to do something else. The students that opt out of the service learning, what they don't yet realize is that they're going to have to scratch like my summer ethics course students did. But my service learning students are going to participate in, they're going to be volunteering at a local farm that's just south of my campus. It's run by this really radical neighborhood association. But they have this great urban farm that has really been vital to the life of this neighborhood. But the farm also participates in a salad program for the local elementary school, and so it's also going to be part of making that transition from the farm to the lunch table in this elementary school and serving the kids their lunch. So it's not just about seeing, here's the skills that I need to do urban farming, but as both of you have been saying, it's about developing relationships with the workers, but also developing relationships with the people who are at the end of the chain of life. So I would say, talking to young people, and I work with young people in my, I wish that I could also say that I'm still a young person, but I work with college students, and I think the challenges that I want to issue them on a daily basis, and I don't know that a good idea of I don't have a magic bullet, or a silver bullet, so to speak, to really rock them out of their predispositions, but I'm getting there, and I think a lot of it has to do with encouraging them to get themselves into situations where they're using their hands and they're forging relationships.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for that discussion. I think, Dan, you might have a question about just typing in the name of the book. Okay, yep.
Yeah.
All right, but otherwise I'm not really seeing any other questions. So I think we can probably go ahead. Oh, nope, we've got one. So, all right. So from Melinda Fowle, it asks about how might we think about the Sabbath and waste and about animal care. So if one of you would like to speak to that.
That's a good one, and Dan's probably best suited to answer it. I'm putting you on the spot, Dan. No pressure. But I can't speak to the idea of Sabbath in relation to person. When I first started, I was referencing this idea that thousands of farm workers on Growan family farms will be working on Thanksgiving rather than being with their family. And if they have been granted a contract by the state of California, who has different farm worker laws in support of farm workers than anywhere else in the country, if they had been granted that, and if that grower had been required by law to institute that, they would be at home with their families, having a paid day off. And so as complex and as political as some of this work can seem on the advocacy end of things, it trickles down to actual everyday, actual events and rights and privileges that so many of us take advantage of. I mean, I know I will be at home with my family celebrating and relaxing and having Sabbath. on and so many will not, and that's unfortunate. And so for me, when I think about Sabbath now, having been in congregational ministry for years and years, I think about Sabbath differently now when I think about the workers that are laboring to feed myself and my family.
As I said in my presentation, for so many in the theological tradition, the purpose of humanity is the contemplation of God. And so our work shouldn't be accidental or ancillary to that, or that participation in contemplation. It should help us contemplate. It should be part of that contemplation. And I think that we have a responsibility to those who work for us to make sure that their work is meaningful ways. And Sabbath certainly is an instrumental part of contemplation and part of having a meaningful life. So that's what I would say about Sabbath. I'll bracket the question about waste for just a second. Maybe I'll come back to it. But as far as animal care goes, if we think about animals as fellow creatures, as I would want to, then it is also our responsibility to draw them up into the contemplation of God. How that is tricky business, and I don't think I'll have any conclusive answers there today. But maybe to offer a theological framework of how we can start thinking about animals and other creatures, even vegetative life. What we need, I think, what we desperately need is a rubric that we can start maybe thinking along, not just in a sort of like a case study basis. We can say like in this case, we're doing right by creation. In this case, we're not. But rather a rubric to start thinking about our habits and our practices, about our lives and the way we live them, and how our lives and the way that we live them not only impact animals and other creatures, but actually inviting animals and other creatures into our lives and into the contemplation and praise of God. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm interested in. That's actually what I'll be talking about at a conference in San Diego this coming weekend. But this is a troubling question. I think it's a dramatically important question, and I hope that others rather than I start saying things to help us address this.
Okay, all right. Thank you all. And we'll go ahead and call that the last question for now. But if you have some more questions for the three of them or the garden, you can send an email to Katie Furrow, that's RROW, @brethren.org, and I will pass it along to the appropriate person to get back to you. So I just want to thank you to Dan and Nico and Lindsay again. We really appreciate that you were able to give us this time. We hope that it's been an informative experience for everyone involved, and to everyone who attended, thank you all for attending as well and giving the time to listen to them speak. Do any of the three of you have any sort of closing remarks or anything like that?
Thanks for the opportunity. Good to meet you, Dan, and Katie, thanks for setting this up.
Yeah.
Nice to meet both of you, Nico and Lindsay, and yeah, I definitely invite further interaction and on some of the questions that there's actually a lot of people out there that specialize in the doctrine of creation and ecological theology. I'm not one of them, and I would be happy to point people in the direction of those resources. Reach out to you, Katie, and you want to pass that on.
Yeah, thank you all for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks.